Welcome to this episode of Season 4 of The Common Bridge, where policy and current events are discussed in a fiercely nonpartisan manner. The host, Richard Helppie, is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and political analyst who has reached over 3.5 million listeners, viewers, and readers around the world. The Common Bridge is available on the Substack website and the Substack app. Just search for The Common Bridge. You can find the program on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. The Common Bridge draws guests and audiences from across the political spectrum, and we invite you to become a free or paid subscriber on your favorite medium.
Hello and welcome to The Common Bridge. I'm your host, Rich Helppie, and we've got one of our favorite guests returning today from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, Dr. Anthony Colangelo, and we're going to be talking about international law. Professor Colangelo, welcome to The Common Bridge.
Thank you.
There's a lot going on in the Ukraine. I don't know that anybody forecasted that the war would turn this way, or the special military operation, as Vladimir Putin captioned it at first. I think he may have changed that. But it does impact a lot of international law. The UN has been investigating. It seems that there's pretty clear evidence of war crimes. We're going to talk today about a concept of universal jurisdiction and what other nation states around the world can do. And of course, we're doing this against this background of what's going to happen next with the bridge to Crimea being destroyed, the Nord Pipeline being destroyed, nuclear saber rattling, and even our own president using the word Armageddon. So very perilous times indeed. But where are we on the international law? Professor, what should we be thinking about today?
Sure. So I think the key issue right now, in light of the UN fact-finding mission, is that war crimes have likely been committed. I actually think, looking at the fact-finding mission, there's no question in my mind that war crimes have been committed. The prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into prosecuting war crimes, or prosecuting for war crimes. And that's actually where a lot of the attention has been focused at this point. What I wanted to talk about is something a little bit different, which is if the ICC, or International Criminal Court, is taking a long time or is not doing a very good job, what other mechanisms are there out there for states to combat war crimes and hold the perpetrators accountable? And here, I think, is where international law has a lot of teeth. There is a concept called universal jurisdiction. And universal jurisdiction allows any state in the world to prosecute the perpetrators of certain crimes against international law. And these would include genocide, crimes against humanity, torture, and war crimes. What's so interesting about this is it does not require any connection to the crimes. So any state can prosecute, and there doesn't have to be a territorial connection, doesn't have to happen on that state's territory, it doesn't have to involve that state's nationals. And my thesis, going back to 2006, when I originally started writing on this topic, it's a real specialty of mine, is that what states are doing when they assert this universal jurisdiction is they're acting as the vessel for the application of international law. It is a decentralized enforcement mechanism for the application and vindication of international law. And this is a thesis that has now been cited and quoted by numerous courts around the country.
So let me see if I understand that. If the UN believes war crimes have been committed, from anybody from a foot soldier to Vladimir Putin himself, Chile, just to pick a random country, could say, we're going to prosecute that war crime, and they would have standing to do that. How would they even go about bringing that case? And it almost sounds like the Texas abortion law. You don't even have to be a party to
Right.
what's going on in order to prosecute.
Yeah. So this I'll give you a little history here. How this started out.
Please.
It started out with piracy. The high
Mm,
seas, nobody had jurisdiction, but these pirates were a scourge on international trade and human rights. And there are cases in our jurisprudence dating back to the founding in which the court said, Chief Justice Marshall, in fact, the pirate is a wolf's head that any man may slay. So
mm.
everybody in the international community has an interest in prosecuting pirates. And
Okay.
today, especially after World War II, there was a big boom in this category of cases to include human rights violations. And the theory is that international law proscribes these at a very, very high level because they are so damaging to the rule of law that every state has an interest in prosecuting. Moreover, if you look at the states that ordinarily would prosecute crimes, it's the territorial state or the national state. But of course, who are the authors of the crimes we're talking about? They're the state itself. So we need some enforcement mechanism outside that state
Hmm.
to have jurisdiction to prosecute crimes that occur inside that state, perpetrated by the very state itself.
Okay. So, in a criminal proceeding, there's a, reasonable doubt that there's a crime. There's um, an investigation done, and then, perhaps an indictment, and then an arrest, and then a trial. Um, I mean, I can't imagine, Vladimir Putin submitting to any of that. And it seems to me that in history, prosecution of war crimes has been the purview of the victor in clear-cut war, post World War II, Nuremberg, post World War II, Japan, and such. How would something like this play out, where this universal jurisdiction would actually have reach into soldiers that have committed atrocities that would be defined as war crimes, or indeed the um, attacks that were directed by Putin would be described as war crimes?
Mm-hmm.
Is there really any teeth in it?
Yeah. So it actually happens. There's the famous case of Israel versus Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann being a Nazi who perpetrated crimes in Germany during World War II when Israel was not even a state. So what would have been the basis of Israeli jurisdiction at that time? It couldn't be that Eichmann committed these crimes on Israeli territory.
Hmm.
Territory didn't
Yeah.
exist. He didn't commit crimes against Israeli nationals. I mean, they were Jewish, but they weren't nationals of the state of Israel. So what was the basis of the crime? The basis of the prosecution? It was the crime itself that gave rise to jurisdiction. Um, I mentioned some of my work being cited and relied upon by courts in the United States. Uh, there are a couple of Somali pirates that are in jail right now because of one of the articles that I wrote.
Tell us about that. That is um, it sounds to me from a lay perspective that's really groundbreaking legal thesis, legal theory. So tell us a little bit about maybe where was the state of the law prior, then your research and subsequent column, and then the application for the Somali pirates. What changed in there?
So basically, there were two ways of thinking about universal jurisdiction in the jurisprudence, and one was that we looked to precedent, um, and the main precedent on this piracy issue was from the founding, around the founding in the early 1800s,
Mhm.
and piracy, as defined by international law then, was robbery on the high seas. And my thesis was that piracy or any universal jurisdiction crime, the definition evolved. with changes in international law. And so the court that upheld the prosecution of the pirate looked to modern day piracy, which was the definition is contained in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And my argument was actually the founders thought that international law was a fluid law. It was evolutionary. It wasn't static. So if we were to be true to the founding thinking on this question, then we too should view international law as an evolving set of norms which captured modern day piracy, because the pirates in the present case, their crimes were not robbery on the high seas. They were shooting at civilian frigates and things like that. So the court sided with me. Another court didn't. I think the court that sided with me is right. But I did want to mention one thing before we move on, which is your question about, or your comments about kind of getting Vladimir Putin into court, or Russian soldiers. The soldiers, it's easier if you can capture them and prosecute. You can prosecute them. You can even kidnap them, and that would be legal under international law. It's a doctrine called male captus bene detentis. The bad captures the good detention. For Putin in particular, and certain high-ranking officials, it's a little bit more difficult because there's something called sovereign immunity. So he, as president of Russia, is immune from suit under international law until he leaves office. It's his status as a high-ranking official that he's immune from suit until he leaves office. But once he leaves office, he can be prosecuted for the crime, for war crimes and the crime of aggression. There's also so that would be his status as a president, status-based immunity. There's another immunity called conduct-based immunity, and that insulates and makes immune from prosecution certain acts taken in the course of official functions of the government. Now here you've got war crimes. Well, war crimes are not official acts. They don't qualify as official acts under international law. So when Putin leaves office, he's subject to prosecution anywhere in the world.
So that makes sense to me because, again, citing post-World War II, those that were prosecuted, they were out of office because their governments no longer existed.
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't claim that the things they did were in the line of duty or because as part of the job. In fact, the famous Nuremberg defense never worked. But as a practical matter, the Allies had control of the geography. They were able to gather up these high-ranking people and bring them to trial. But I mean, as a practical matter, Vladimir Putin's not going to leave Russia,
Right.
and so nobody's going to go in there and make an arrest. Even some of like our well-publicized arrests that we had, Roger Stone, 24 guys going in to get him. And so I don't know how we're going to be able to reach him. And isn't there a parallel here that there were people outside and perhaps within the United States after the Iraq War saying that President Bush should have been arrested for a war crime? Is it the same theory?
It is the same theory, yes.
And the crime is the invasion, not the conduct of the soldiers on the ground, like attacking civilian targets.
It's both.
It's both. Okay.
So it's both. So there are two categories of war crimes. One goes to the invasion, and that's called jus ad bellum. JUSADBELLUM is the Latin for it. Okay. And that is the law governing the territorial sovereignty of the state that's been violated. So here, aggression is a violation of jus ad bellum. The other category of crimes are jus in bello. So JUSINBELLO is the Latin for that. And those are the war crimes. So you can have, for example, a war that is perfectly legitimate, a war of self-defense, right? So here we've got Ukraine now. Ukraine's acting in self-defense, perfectly legal under international law, but the Ukraine soldiers can still commit war crimes. They could violate the jus in bello, even though the jus ad bellum is perfectly fine.
I see. So thinking back, in our history, um, Vietnam, and if memory serves me correctly, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, late in his life, said he probably could have been prosecuted for war crimes. Is that because some of the atrocities that were carried out by military people under his command did something, or because of violating the territorial integrity of another country? Or
That if he said war crimes, um, he was probably referring to the jus in bello, the conduct of the soldiers in Vietnam, and his the the liability would run from those soldiers straight up to him,
mm-hmm.
straight up to the top of the chain of command. That would be my guess, but I don't know what was going on inside his head.
Yeah, right. And it could be that the policies of the carpet bombing and things that we were doing, indiscriminately
Yeah, and
hitting.
that would be a
Uh,
war crime. That would be a war
yeah,
crime. Yeah.
right. Uh, so as this conflict in Ukraine grinds on, I know there's been more talk about the weaponry that we've sent into Ukraine, and if memory serves me correctly, that you felt we were legally justified, we being the United States, legally justified in doing that. Um, First of all, did I recall that correctly? And do we have? I'm not going to comment on the policy itself, but just the legality. Are Is one country allowed to arm another as much as we've armed Ukraine?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. Article 51 of the UN Charter says collective self defense. And this is a collective self defense. I think I think it's perfectly legal, yes.
Do we know that in history has there ever been a surrender, a ceasefire, or any cessation of hostilities where one of the terms was non-prosecution of war crimes?
Well, what there of war crimes? I would have to think about it some more. Um, but there are um, amnesties that have been set up um, for human rights abuses. That's the first thing that pops into my head. Um, so kind of like truth and reconciliation,
Hmm.
that type of commission. What was happening in the background there? I don't know if I don't know if I can come up with a war crimes instance off the top of my head.
Well, it's comforting to know there is such a thing as universal jurisdiction. Um, I would think a person in Vladimir Putin's place probably is thinking about winning the war first, um, because really not much risk absent a defeat. We've had Professor Jesse Kaufman on talking about what may happen the Ukraine, and his view was that this war would not end without regime change,
Mm-hmm.
either in Moscow or Kiev. So it seems to me that much of this might be academic at those senior levels, but those soldiers that would be captured would be subject to prosecution. And I believe one of them actually pled guilty
Mm-hmm.
at one point. He's been sentenced to 10 years in a Ukraine prison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. That we stand a very small chance of getting Putin in our courts. But as you say, I mean, he's not going to be leaving Russia anytime soon, and we could capture him. That's an option. It's going to be very hard, but I don't know that we want to do that for any number of reasons. But but it also does tie into the allegations against President Bush and President and Donald Rumsfeld
Hmm.
from the Iraq War, that it was a violation of international law, and therefore, Belgium should be able to prosecute.
So you mean you think it was a leap legally for Saudi Arabians trained in Afghanistan attacking us on 9/11 didn't warrant a military invasion of Iraq? Who'd have thunk it?
No, no, that's not what I'm saying. I hope.
No, I'm just saying that I understand the connection that I'm sure the Iraqis, and we know Saddam Hussein was surprised by the attack.
Yeah,
Um, and similarly, Ukraine was surprised, not surprised by the attack. And look, this is changing the face of Europe. It's changing the role of NATO. Finland now 700 plus mile border with Russia, joining NATO.
hmm
These are seminal events that are going to play out for decades, if not longer. And what takeaway lessons do we want to leave for the readers, the viewers, and the listeners of the Common Bridge, most of whom are not familiar at all, like me, with the topics around the law as it pertains to war and military aggression?
yeah. I would just say there is a justice mechanism out there called universal jurisdiction. It's little understood, but it's quite powerful, and it provides a forum for the vindication of human rights and killed civilians. Uh, and There's been a lot of talk about the International Criminal Court, but I guess what I would push is this conversation doesn't need to stop there.
Hmm.
Okay, that there's this very long-standing doctrine that that states can rely upon in order to bring the perpetrators of war crimes to justice.
So, if a foot soldier today is on Ukraine soil and is tempted to do something, attack a civilian, murder, rape, torture, that the long arm of international law may reach them someday at the cessation of hostilities, and they could be sentenced. I don't know what the sentences are, if they're prison or death, but that they're running that risk every day they're invading into Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, look, here's the thing. What do we want our criminal law to do? Right? I mean, this is a fundamental question. We want to punish. Of course, we want to punish people who commit human rights abuses and war crimes. But we also want to deter.
Hmm.
So, exactly going back exactly to your hypothetical, here's this guy. He's on the battlefield. He's tempted to commit a war crime. There is this mechanism out there to hold him accountable. Does that deter him? Even a little bit? Then nothing, which would be the alternative? And I would say, even if it deters him just a little bit, and you aggregate that and multiply it across all of these soldiers, you're seeing a real difference in the way human actors behave in the waging of war. Um, because again, the alternative is nothing. So when people say to me, "Well, oh, international law doesn't exist; it doesn't exert any coercive power," I mean, I think the answer is no, it does. And what's the alternative?
No, I concur with you, and my memory is long enough to understand the prosecutions during the Vietnam War, when our military did horrible things, but they were held accountable. In fact, there's some heroic stories about other units coming in to prevent
Mhm.
massacres and further bloodshed to innocent people. Um, Professor, you're always so generous with your time, and I'm so glad we have people like you working on the cutting edge of these issues. Uh, Before we wrap up today, any anything that we haven't talked about, or any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our listenership?
We covered a lot of ground, didn't we?
We sure did.
Yeah. So nothing's coming to mind.
We've been talking today on the Common Bridge with Professor Anthony Colangelo of Southern Methodist University, and some intriguing angles on the war in Ukraine. Please look up Professor Colangelo's biography and some of his writings. There are good people working on good things out there, and that's what the Common Bridge is about. So join us on the Common Bridge at substack.com. And for today, this is your host, Rich Helppie, signing off on the Common Bridge.
Thanks for joining us on the Common Bridge. Subscribe to the Common Bridge on substack.com or use their Substack app, where you can find more interviews, columns, videos, and nonpartisan discussions of the day. Just search for the Common Bridge. You can also find the Common Bridge on Mission Control Radio on your Radio Garden app.